Trapped with Daniel, Chapter 11. Chapter 11 I'll let him rot in jail. Mr. Shwe was now very nervous. Jerry Shao, Janet Shao. Damn it, he thought. He seemed to have screwed around with the wrong people. But he did it under the desk, and nobody had seen what he did. He just stubbornly refused to admit it. Janet was mad at Daniel and was reluctant to accept his offer. She took back her phone and said, "Jerry, I'm going to sue him. I'll let him rot in jail." Jerry comforted his sister, "Jane, I trust you. I'll wait for Daniel's call." "Why do you have to wait for Daniel's call?" "He wants me to leave." "You say you trust me, but actually you don't." Janet was so disappointed with Jerry that she decided to call her dad instead. Before Jerry could say anything, Janet said, "I'll call Samuel." And then she hung up the phone on him. When Janet was dialing her father's number, Daniel took away her phone. "Knock it off. Let me handle it." Daniel inadvertently saw the burns on Janet's hand and his eyes darkened in an instant. Janet bit her lower lip. "He is the boss. Let's just see what he's going to do." Janet found a place and sat down, waiting for Daniel to handle the delicate matter. Daniel immediately asked the doctor to treat Janet's burned hand. There were only Daniel, Spark, Mr. Shwe, Mr. Ming and Janet in the meeting room. Daniel sat at the head of the desk without uttering a single word, tapping it with his fingers for a long time. The coldness he radiated gradually repressed the atmosphere in the meeting room, giving a chilly sensation to all those present in the room. Mr. Shwe fixed his clothes from time to time, and Mr. Ming was also a little bit nervous after hearing that Janet was indeed Samuel Shao's daughter. Spark sat there calm, just like Daniel did. He looked at Janet, who was constantly fuming with anger, and thought that she looked funny. When Janet was about to impatiently open her mouth, Daniel said, "Mr. Shwe, we have worked together for several years. Surely you must know what I hate the most, don't you?" Mr. Shwe was deceptive, and he cleared his throat before he spoke. "Mr. Si, I have worked with you for many years. When have I ever deceived you? This little girl is lying." Janet was about to defend herself, but Daniel cast a warning glance at her and Janet closed her mouth. "Mr. Shwe, which part of Janet's body did you touch?" "I didn't touch her." Trapped with Daniel, Chapter 12. Chapter 12 Don't try to seduce me. Daniel held the cigarette between his index and middle fingers and gave her a glance. "You are a lady." Janet almost spat blood out of her mouth in anger. She was discontented, and walked up to Daniel and straightened her back in front of him. "You dare doubt me? Let me show you what kind of a woman I am." Her next move made Daniel choke on his cigarette smoke. She started unbuttoning her shirt, and when Daniel had finished coughing, his eyes had already become bigger and wilder. Fortunately, she wore a white sun top inside, which suddenly relieved Daniel. But when he saw her body curve again, his mind turned blank at once. Without knowing it, he started breathing faster. Janet looked at his face and buttoned up her shirt with satisfaction. But creak, the meeting room was now open, and Kim froze at what she saw. Daniel drew back his sight, and coldly said, "Janet Shao, don't try to seduce me. It won't work on me." Get back to work at once. Kim immediately understood what was going on. And Janet broke down in an instant. Daniel acted as if he did not feel Janet's anger, and kept speaking cold-heartedly, "I already have a girlfriend. Janet Shao, you should remember that at all times and keep away from me." Janet freaked out immediately and threw a punch at him. Daniel was agile and immediately dodged that her fist missed him and her whole body fell forward. Daniel slightly moved and Janet eventually fell into his arms. Okay. It was now harder to explain what was going on. Seeing the smug Daniel above her, Janet wanted to cry but couldn't shed any tears. Ahaha. She wanted to kill Daniel with all her heart. So, before she started to work again, a rumor had gone all over the company that the new employee in the secretarial department, Janet Shao, had tried to seduce the CEO himself. Plus, Kim didn't tell people who Janet really was, so Janet was isolated in no time. She even was the last one to eat during lunch breaks, and her colleagues always left her on duty in the secretarial department. And when it was her turn to eat, she didn't have enough time before she started work again. So she ate lunch as quickly as a guerrilla war happened every single day. This went on every day, so Janet was about to freak out. She was not happy about anything recently happening in her life. Trapped with Daniel, Chapter 13. Chapter 13. Do you want to be fired? Okay. Let's talk about Jerry and Sally's marriage sometimes. Speaking of Jerry and Sally's marriage, Ella finally smiled. Then they hung up the phone. Take it easy. Lola will go to the company tomorrow and see how is Jane doing there. Ella took a glance at Samuel. He can rest assured now. Samuel nodded and said, I feel relieved. Thank you. At the SL group there were a few parking space on the square, and Janet was too lazy to park in the underground car park. She drove around the square and finally found one. When Janet was busy backing up her car, a red BMW parked on the parking space she wanted. Janet got out of the car and stopped the owner of the BWM. Excuse me, I found this parking space first. I was just backing the car. One of Janet's virtues was that she never goaded others first. Even when she encountered this kind of situations, she always tried the fairest means before ever resorting to force. However, the girl seemed to look down on Janet. She gave Janet a cold stare and immediately left the parking space. Looking at her figure, Janet felt angry. She got back into her car and parked it close in front of the BMW. The BMW was now being sandwiched by a park behind and Janet's Mercedes in the front. Let's wait and see. After parking her car, Janet took a quick look at the BMW, snorted and entered the company's building with her bag in her hand. It was almost noon now, and some colleagues went out for lunch. When Janet was printing some documents, someone called out to her, Janet Shao, the beauty Linda Yang of the Public Relations Department is looking for you. Linda Yang? The name was quite strange to Janet and besides, she had never worked with the Public Relations Department before. Why was she looking for her? Janet wondered who she was and walked through the secretary department hall. A girl wearing rose-red casual clothes had her back to her. This girl in rose-red clothes was the same as the one who drove the BMW this morning. The girl turned around and stared at Janet, Janet Shao, I heard you seduced the boss. You bitch, how dare you park your car in front of mine? Do you want to be fired? Trapped with Daniel, Chapter 14. Chapter 14. Daniel gets along pretty well with his girlfriend. Why did Jane slap you? Asked Lola. She looked her straight in the eye. She knew that Jane was little feisty sometimes, but Jane would never hurt anyone for no reason. Linda was embarrassed. She tried to open her mouth and utter some words, but nothing seemed to be coming out. Speak, demanded Daniel. And Linda startled to blurt it out, because I accused her that she seduced our CEO. Everyone knows the rumor. Daniel looked thoughtful. Could our last meeting have caused this lot of trouble to Jane? I thought she was grumpy. But why didn't she complain about it? Lola let go of Janet, stepped in front Linda with an explicit sneer on her face and looked at all the people who were now lowering their heads. Listen up, Janet is not only a godchild to me, she will also be my daughter-in-law. If any of you bully her or backbite her again, I swear you will be kicked out of the SL group forever. Her words created a heated discussion again between the employees in the secretary department. Was Janet the CEO's fiancée? Janet was also dumbfounded when she heard this. When did she become Daniel's fiancée? How couldn't she have known that? Daniel looked at his mischievous mother and frowned. He had to talk with her at once about what was happening. Not here, but in his office. Mother, I am not. Janet tried talking, but Lola's wink stopped her. Daniel closely watched Janet. Huh? How was it then that Jane wanted to keep a distance with him? I don't know the source of the rumor, but flirting is normal in a relationship. There is no such thing as the seduction rumor. Everyone should focus instead on their own work. If you spread this kind of rumor again, you will, I repeat, be immediately fired from the SL group. Lola showed enough respect to Janet in front of the others to protect her from being bullied again. At the CEO's office on the 88th floor, Janet and Lola sat on the couch, and Harry and Daniel were talking about their business affairs. Lola took a brocade box out of her bag and handed it to Janet. Jane, darling, won't you try something on you? Here, have a look at these. Lola opened the box and took out a pair of earrings. Trapped with Daniel, Chapter 15. Chapter 15. You take the engagement as a trifling matter. Janet wanted to pull her hand out of Daniel's, but he gripped it even tighter and warned her, I advise you to heed me. If you still resist me, I'll throw you out immediately. How dare he be so rough to her? When she heard what he was capable of spitting out of his mouth, Janet ground her teeth and tried to raise her right leg to kick him, but Daniel was faster and pressed it back with his own. Janet was not convinced and now tried to raise her left leg. But this time, Daniel stepped on her foot from the start. Ouch! That hurt. The bastard! Doesn't he know that men should be gentle to women? Janet raised their hands and bit him. Daniel looked at Janet furiously. He didn't feel the pain, but felt her soft red lips. Daniel kept his mouth shut and Janet was embarrassed and loosened her teeth. Seeing the deep teeth prints etched on his hand, Janet was pleased. She stuck her tongue out and said, ha ha ha. If you get scars on your hand, no one will ever want to marry you. Daniel looked at her and sneered. That was absurd. Even if he had scars on his face, he would still have a ton of admirers. Mother, I agree with what you said. Daniel eventually let go of Janet's hand. See how he fought her back. Lola felt more happy and relieved at Daniel's words. Great. I'll post the news tomorrow and let everyone know about it. After hearing their words, Janet loosened her hand immediately and ran up to Lola. Mom asterisk, I'm not marrying him. He must have his own sinister motives. Trust me, please. TN asterisk, sworn mother, Daniel wanted to be engaged to her? Janet wasn't that stupid to believe that Daniel was willing to engage her. Don't worry, Jane. Daniel is a good boy. If he dares to bully you ever again, we will teach him a lesson he won't ever forget. Harry had been quiet for a long time, and hearing Lola's words, he nodded his head. Dad, Mom, listen to me. I saw Daniel with a girl hugging with each other last night. Are you jealous? Asked Daniel, who was now comfortably sitting on the couch. Janet didn't know why Daniel acted so shameless. She suddenly had an idea, and said, Mom, I agree with what you said. Daniel S.I., wait and see. Trapped with Daniel, Chapter 16. Chapter 16. Why do you always refuse to help me get out of trouble during breaks? Bilhan ran towards a squad, out of which its members were practicing creeping forward not that far away. He waved at the military officer who was commanding the training and spoke to him, Cousin Brian, come on already. After he seriously stared at Bill, who was now grinning cheekily, Brian yelled at the team members who were creeping forward, fall in. More than 20 members of the team stood neatly in a row within only just 1 minute. Take a 5-minute break on the spot. Dismissed. Brian walked up to Bill, who was waiting for him under a tree. He then took off his service cap and said, Bill, do you know you've disturbed me during the training? Since this is your first time, you don't have to run the 10 kilometers as your punishment. But don't forget, I'll let you off only this time. Okay, Brian. Bill immediately stood up straight on his feet and gave a military-like salute to Brian. His behavior, which looked serious enough, brought a smile on Brian's swarthy face. Well, what's up? Tell me, quick. Bill anxiously took out an envelope from his pocket and gave it Brian. Brian, would you please do me a favor? Bill was miserable and couldn't get in touch with anyone, because his mobile phone had been confiscated by his grandfather when he was enrolled in the troops. He could only get in touch with the people outside of the camp using the old-fashioned way. Brian took the military envelope after taking a brief glance at it. Please help me send it to Janet, who works at the SL group. Bill had no chance to use his mobile phone and also couldn't get out of the troops under the strict surveillance he was being put under. But Brian, who had just been promoted to lieutenant colonel, could not only get out of the camp, but could also get out with the orderlies at any time, and without any supervision by anyone. I won't help you. Brian handed the envelope back to Bill. Such an awful guy. How dare he make me his courier and even ask me to send an envelope to a woman? Brian, I'm so miserable, would you please have mercy on me? If your to-be sister-in-law runs off with anyone else, could you at least be able to bring her back to me? Bill's grandfather had confiscated Bill's mobile phone and had kept him from contacting Janet, which made him very angry. Luckily, he met Shirley, who returned home during the field training the day before and learned that Janet worked at the SL Group. But Shirley's phone had just run out of power, and so he still couldn't call Janet at that time. Trapped with Daniel, Chapter 17. Chapter 17. Now behave yourself and go back home. Now Jordan Han was holding Janet in his arms, unable to either think or move, and Kate Song was hugging Daniel tight in her arms. The situation they were in was very weird. When he saw what was happening, Spark stepped back a couple of paces and went around them silently and slipped into his Bentley. Daniel pushed Kate off of him and strode towards Janet, who he rudely dragged down off the man in the army uniform she was up on. "Janet Shao, this is the company's gate," warned Daniel. "Of course I know this is the company's gate. Do you think I'm blind?" Janet thought better and decided that she shouldn't listen to Daniel anymore. She couldn't believe that he refused to help her, not even in her worst moments of fear. When she thought of this, Janet felt hurt and her eyes became instantly red. This proved that Daniel did, indeed, really hate her. "Then take care of your esteem. How ridiculous of you to be climbed on a man here." She wasn't just hugging him, Janet was climbed up the man with her legs on his waist. Daniel was so furious that rage seemed to be burning in his eyes, and he wasn't even conscious of it. Facing his blaming words in such a loud voice, Janet suddenly burst into tears. "It's none of your business. I just want to hug him." Then she threw herself into Jordan's arms again. Daniel's look in his eyes was so sharp that it seemed it was just about to pierce straight through the soldier who seemed to have popped up out of nowhere. Kate watched all of this in silence, and judging from Daniel's reaction, she knew that this little girl, who was embracing an unknown man, was not a common girl after all. Janet cried like a little baby, and Brian fondled her head like a big brother. He stared back at Daniel fearless. "Mr. Soldier, you are so handsome. Can you please be my boyfriend?" Janet thought that she had to go back and tell her sworn mother that she would not be engaged to Daniel anymore. Brian, with a smile on his tanned face, asked with a gentle voice, "What's your name?" Janet choked a little, and after she wiped her tears off, she said to Brian, "My handsome boy, my name is Janet Shao." Brian was dumbfounded when he heard this name. Janet Shao. Brian's hand stopped and remained still above her head. When Daniel noticed the strange expressions on Brian's face, he rudely dragged Janet off his arms, and said, "Now behave yourself and go back home." "And why should I listen to you?" protested Janet. She tried to get rid of his big hands around her. From an outsider's perspective, they looked like a couple that quarreled in the street. "Janet Shao." The man called out her name softly, which made Janet suddenly turn back and curiously look at him. He took out something out of his pocket and handed it over to Janet. "Here is a letter from Bill." "Bill?" Janet was eager to know about what had happened to Bill and why he hadn't shown up yet for days. She got rid of Daniel and took the folded envelope from Brian's hand. "Thank you. Where is Bill now?" With a sunny smile on her face, the girl was so happy to have received this letter, but the smile implied nothing about happiness. It was just the pleasure of catching up with an old friend. Her reaction made Brian feel unexpectedly more relaxed. Bill is now in the suburban troop unit. Looking at her face, Brian couldn't help but adding some words. If you want to write him back a letter, you can contact me and I could help you deliver it to him. That's good. How could I contact you? Bill was a good friend, and of course she was going to write back to him. Brian took out his mobile phone and touched open the screen lock. Tell me your phone number, I'll call now so you can save my number. Janet then also took out her phone from her bag and they exchanged numbers. Brian gave Janet one more glance and then he went back to his military vehicle and left. Janet put both her phone and the letter into her bag. She briefly looked at Daniel and then walked up to her Mercedes-Benz and got in it. She started the car and turned it around in the parking lot. When she was about to leave, a figure suddenly jumped in front of the car and startled Janet. She immediately stepped on the brake. Her forehead hit hard against the steering wheel. She massaged her painful forehead and opened the window, shouting at Daniel, "Daniel S.I. What the hell are you doing?" Paying no attention to her, Daniel opened the door of the front passenger seat, grabbed her bag and took out her phone. There was no unlock code on her phone. Daniel tittered for a moment and thought that she indeed was just a little girl that held no secrets. After making a few changes on her phone, he put it back in her bag, threw it into the car and violently shut the door behind him. He then walked towards his Bentley. Everything happened so fast that when Janet came to her senses to react, Daniel had already boarded his Bentley. That pretty girl and the Samoyed dog also followed him. Kate looked mean at the furious girl, and then closed the door. The Bentley slowly drove away. Janet checked her phone, but couldn't find out what Daniel had done with it. Finally she gave up and drove away. Back home, she discovered she was all alone. Samuel and Ella, along with their son, had gone back to the old house. Janet closed the door of her room and opened the letter from Bill. It wrote, "Jane, there is a saying that one day away from a dear one is like being away for 3 whole seasons. We haven't seen each other for some seasons. I miss you every day. Do you miss me?" Janet felt goosebumps all over her body when reading this, and she touched her skin and continued reading. "I am fine and doing well in the troops, but I am not allowed to go out. Can you wait for me? Wait for me to marry you. It won't be long, maybe 1 or 2 years, but I will finish the training eventually, and I'll do everything that's needed to escape out of this prison as soon as possible and finally be with you." Oh. No, not the prison, the troop unit. Then he wrote a little about his daily life in the military camp. At the end of the letter, Bill wrote, "Dear Jane, wait for me. I love you. My darling. Your Bill." Rubbing her skin again, Janet felt more and more puzzled. She wondered if Bill would have been able to say something so passionate like this before he went away. However, Janet felt it interesting enough that he wrote a letter, with all the communication ways available that were so convenient nowadays. So she drove out and also bought an envelope and a piece of paper from a store nearby a school. When she came back, she was surprised to see that Daniel's car was parked in front of the community's gates. The windows of the back seat were open and Daniel was smoking, with his girlfriend next to him. They were talking about something and Kate laughed happily. While she was looking at them, the huge Samoyed dog poked out its head and barked out at her. Janet was so startled that she nearly drove the car off the road. She quickly reacted and carefully turned back the steering wheel, or else the car might have crashed in the green space. She turned to look around and was about to stare back at the Samoyed dog, but found that the man and the woman in the car were now holding together one another. "Daniel, you playboy. You promised the engagement on one hand, but on the other hand you're now holding another woman in your arms." She suspected that he promised her sworn mother the engagement just to insult her even further. At the thought of this, Janet stepped on the gas and quickly left the premises. When the Benz disappeared from sight, Kate let go Daniel in the car. Daniel put out the cigarette in the car's ashtray and, with an unfriendly face, he said to Kate cold-heartedly, "Kate, I haven't promised you anything. Never come so close to me again." Trapped with Daniel, Chapter 18. Chapter 18. You want me to spend the night here? Kate looked at Daniel, and spoke with sadness in her voice, "But Daniel, you've already promised me. Why did you change your mind so suddenly?" "Why?" Daniel didn't have the slightest idea himself. "I haven't promised you." Kate touched her hair and probably guessed his reason in her mind. "Daniel, today my father demanded me to get married again." Of course, her father didn't urge her at all to marry Daniel Si. She wasn't even Daniel's girlfriend, let alone his fiancée. Because he wanted to expand his company, her father had demanded of her to marry an old man who was over 30 years older than she was. Kate had to sacrifice her own happiness for her father's company. "Okay, I got it." Kate bit her lip. "Daniel, if you propose to me, my father will break off my engagement to Lian Feng," said Kate. "Kate, when I agreed to be with you, I told you I admired you because you are rational and decisive. Do you think you are rational in this moment?" Daniel closed his eyes and leaned back in the driver's seat, thinking of the angry little face of Janet. Daniel shook this image off from his mind. He admired the mature and decisive Kate instead of the capricious and stroppy Jane Shao. Kate felt pain seep into her heart. "Sorry, Daniel. I was too worried and got carried away." Daniel hated other people who tried to figure out his mind, and Kate didn't know his mind at all at this moment. Spark, send Kate back home. Daniel opened the door and got out of the car. Kate was about to stop him, but held back when she remembered of Daniel's frigid manner. "Daniel, see you." Daniel nodded his head and strode up on the alley towards the villa. Soon after he had made his first money when he was 15, Daniel had moved here from the Eastern Manor. In the following years he spent most of his time abroad, and therefore seldom lived here. It was not until he took over SL Group officially that he came back here more often. His villa had never been visited by others, including Kate Song, the only exceptions being his family. When he passed a villa, his eyes swept to a lighted room up on the second floor. Daniel pulled up his sleeve and saw the shallower tooth marks on his arm. If Sally hadn't asked him to pick up Jane when she came back home from abroad, he had already forgotten this stroppy little girl. Every time he took a shower, he would deliberately try to ignore the teeth markings on his arm. In that year he was bitten by Jane in a restaurant. Daniel looked at the new tooth prints on the back of his hand and didn't expect to see that even after all this while she was even more hostile and wild than ever. If he remembered correctly, the lighted room on the second floor was her room. Suddenly, a scream was heard coming from the room. Daniel felt alarmed and ran to the villa to see what was going on up there. Daniel looked around and climbed up the sturdy tree next to the house, despite wearing a white silk shirt. He then jumped to the balcony of the second floor, but saw that the glass window was locked. He frowned and knocked hard at the window. Janet was playing with her mobile phone. When she heard the knock on the window, she became scared. What was that sound? Talk, talk, talk. Who could be knocking at her window? She picked up a spray deodorant that was on the dresser, as there was nothing else to protect herself with. Janet then dialed 911 and opened the window, but she felt relieved after seeing the familiar face. Janet threw the spray away, locked her phone screen and angrily opened the window. Daniel S.I., are you out of your mind? How dared he climb up to her window at night? Daniel jumped into the room and gazed around. He didn't find anything suspicious. Why were you screaming? Daniel frowned and looked at Janet. She decorated her room in such a childish style. Right? Janet had almost forgotten about what had happened just a few moments ago. She unlocked her phone, opened the address book, showed it to Daniel and questioned him. Daniel S.I., did you delete the soldier's phone number? Daniel ignored her phone and stared at Janet. So you screamed like that just because I deleted his number? I did. You deleted his number. How can I contact him now, and send bill letters? I hate you. Daniel took her phone and threw it on her pink bed. Don't get so mad over a such little thing next time. Then Daniel walked towards the door, and was just about to leave Janet's room. Stop. You didn't give me back his phone number. You are not allowed to leave yet. Janet followed him and pulled his shirt. Daniel looked at his wrinkled shirt, turned around and stared at Janet with a bad smile painted on his mug. What? You want me to spend the night here? Spend the night here? Janet's face instantly turned red. She loosened his shirt at once and said, as if, get out. It's annoying to even just see you. Her last words irritated Daniel. He had never seen a woman who hated him with so much fervor. He grabbed her by the wrist and pressed her next to him. Jane Shao, do you really want me to leave? They were close to each other, and Janet's face flushed even more. But she quickly straightened up her body and stared at him in the eye. Of course. What are you going to do about it? Stay here until the spring festival. After she said this, Daniel threw her on the bed and pressed on her with his body. Janet was shocked and stared at Daniel with an angry look in her eyes. Seeing Daniel lowering his head, Janet immediately knew what he was going to do next. Daniel S.I., how dare you, No matter how hard she slapped him in the face, Daniel didn't release her. Instead, he tightened his grip and deepened the kiss. After a long time, Daniel raised his head and looked at Janet, who was now gasping for breath. Jane Shao, go to work at the 88th floor tomorrow. Besides this, be honest in front of me from now on. Otherwise, I'll teach you a lesson. Janet was stunned by Daniel's words and his expression. Daniel is handsome if you look at him more closely. He was even more handsome than that soldier. Why hadn't I seen this before? And then Janet suddenly had an idea. She pushed away Daniel and pressed him down with her body. She ignored his angry face and raised his chin. Daniel, you are in my house now. Do you believe me when I say that I'll sue you for trespassing and rap? She changed her words in an instant after seeing Daniel's furious eyes. Robbery. Daniel dashed her hand aside, pressed her back against the bed and held her hands above her head. Janet had no chance to resist this rapid series of moves. Trapped with Daniel, Chapter 19. Chapter 19. Can you be like Uzziah? Why then what about me doing something more, so that you can accuse me of a few more crimes? When Daniel rested his big palms on her waist, Janet shivered a little and then immediately shook her head in denial. Daniel stopped and stared with cold eyes at the girl, who finally now had the consciousness of fear, and said, "Come up to work in the office up at the 88th floor tomorrow." "Don't let me repeat that again." Janet felt puzzled. "Why do you want to force me to work in that office? I was doing so well in secretary department. Why are you talking such nonsense?" Daniel lowered his head, and without patience he kissed her sweet red lips again. Janet was an absolutely alluring woman, this, or she had some sort of drug on her lips that made him want to kiss her again and again. "Jane, I've brought you some takeout food as dinner. Come, quickly." The door was pushed open from outside and Janet felt that in that moment her brain had been suddenly blown up. Daniel was shocked, too. They didn't expect that Jerry would come back right now, and he also forgot to stand up straight the moment he saw him come through the door. The takeout food nearly dropped out of Jerry's hand, and Jerry looked at the man and woman on the bed with doubt, and said, "I'm so sorry, I forgot to knock at the door." The door was closed again and Jerry patted his head. He always knocked at the door before he entered his sister's room, but why did he forget to do it this time? And that man, if he indeed saw what he saw, was Daniel. How fast their relationship was progressing. Jerry was lost in his thoughts when the door of Janet's room was opened. Daniel's face had now returned to normal, and he said, "Jerry, I should go now." "What?" He would just leave without leaving any explanation about what had just happened. He stopped Daniel in his tracks, who was about to go downstairs. "Daniel, I just got hold of the information from my mother that you and Jane are going to be engaged." That was why Jerry was not angry to see him behaving like that. But Daniel hesitated for a while and threw out some words, "It's still uncertain." Jerry's face suddenly darkened and then walked up towards Daniel closer. "What does that mean? I saw you lying on the bed with my sister, but now you're telling me that the engagement is uncertain? What the hell are you doing?" "I have done nothing, it was Jane who tempted me to come in the first place. If it were not for her scream, I wouldn't have come in." Daniel thought. Janet hid herself and listened on their conversations, but when she heard what Daniel had just said she suddenly rushed out and confronted him. "Daniel, what's that nonsense you're talking about?" "What nonsense? Didn't you scream?" Janet was led into the logic of his questions and nodded. "I passed by and heard her screaming, and then I came up here." It seemed clearly that Daniel had come here because he worried about Janet's safety. "Okay, you indeed came up here, but why did you have to kiss her?" Jerry wouldn't forget the most important point. "She held my chin and flirted with me." "Jerry, you are a rational, sane man. Can you be like Uzziah? Why? *TN, Liu Ziyai was an ancient man in Chinese history who was known as a very upright gentleman who always kept his morality, even if a woman sat on his legs for the whole night. Jerry's and Janet's logic were now guided by Daniel's analysis, and headed towards the wrong direction. Jerry was still pondering Daniel's words seriously, and he could do nothing but surrender the argument. It was exactly the same as the time he faced Daniel's sister Sally. With a thin smile on his face, Daniel was pleased and looked at Janet, who was now dumbfounded. He then went downstairs. "You bastard!" Janet was infuriated. After all, he was the one who entered her room and had pressed her on the bed under him in the first place. How was it that now it seemed that she was the one who initiated the whole thing? Janet had to accept all the blames from Jerry that a girl shouldn't be so naughty and wild and must treasure herself and always keep in a low profile. Janet was so angry with all of this that she badly wanted to spit out some foul language to ease her nerves. After the lectures she received from Jerry, Janet asked brother, "Where is Daniel living?" "In mansion number 9, behind us." Jerry looked at his sister, who was gnawing on the chopsticks with her teeth, and asked, "What? Do you still want to go and see him?" Lost deep in thought, Janet nodded, but then shook her head when she remembered of Jerry's reproaches from just now. Daniel was her target now, and he would be punished to death. Early in the next morning, and under the begrudging eyes of the others, Janet took the elevator up to the 88th floor. Spark had prepared a working desk in the secretary area for her, and when Janet sat down to work, both of them exchanged the forced smiles that naturally showed up on their face. Janet was well behaved today, which puzzled Spark completely. And so was Daniel, and not knowing what Janet was up to, he smoked one cigarette after one, relaxed and without a care in the world. After work, Janet went out after Daniel and started following him. Where Daniel was, Janet was. "In the parking lot. You are off duty now, why are you following me?" asked Daniel. Daniel stood beside his car, and massaged his aching temples. He had to engage in some social activities soon and definitely had no time to deal with her at the moment. Janet spread out her hands, and said, "I didn't drive my car today, so I came to ask for a ride back home." "Ask for a ride? Are you sure?" Daniel nodded, opened the car's back door and got in it. He didn't refuse her. Janet was surprised. To avoid sitting next to him, Janet sat on the front passenger's seat. Not a word was uttered, there was complete silence in the car. 10 minutes later, Janet noticed that they were not going in the correct directions of the mansion. "Mr. Shi, where are we going?" she asked in a low voice. Spark smiled, and said, "We are going to pick up Miss Song and afterwards we'll be going to meet some clients in a bar." "Miss Song?" she asked. "Yep." Spark nodded, but he didn't intend to tell her who Miss Song was. Why didn't Daniel tell her that he was not going back to the mansion? He was a despicable kind of man. "Stop here, I have to get off." Spark was ready to stop the car, but Daniel broke the silence and said, "You want to get in and out of my car at your free will? No way." So Spark had to keep on driving. Janet bit her underlip a little. She thought to herself, "Daniel, you scheming bastard. Why didn't you tell me that you had an appointment to attend to?" "Fine, I'll return home by taxi, humph. The Bentley stopped at the gates of a company, and Janet clearly saw the company's name, Chongshenko, Limited. A lady in a creamy white dress stood by the roadside and walked towards the Bentley the moment she laid her eyes on it. She opened one of the back seat doors and got in. Oh, she is Miss Song. Unlike her impressions on Kate last time, today Kate tied up high of her long hair, and she was in a creamy white dress, white high-heel shoes, and with a black handbag. She had on some light makeup and her lips were painted rosy, and this time left the impression that she was actually quite capable and experienced. Kate, of course, when she entered the car, saw Janet sitting in the front seat too. She asked, "Daniel, aren't we going to meet Mr. Fu?" "Yep." "Then why is she, hey there, pretty girl. I'm Daniel's girlfriend." Janet had turned around and had said just that in her face. And then with a big grin on her face she looked at Kate, who was trying in some way to control her facial expressions. She is Daniel's girlfriend. Kate felt heartbroken immediately when she heard this. Is this true? No, denied Daniel, clearly refusing to save any face for Janet. And to top it all, after Kate had just calmed down, Daniel said, "Kate, be my girlfriend." This sentence all of a sudden silenced everybody in the car. Trapped with Daniel, Chapter 20. Chapter 20. Both his lover and his neighbor Kate, at first, was very surprised, but soon enough after she saw Daniel's eyes, her heart froze in an instant. She nodded her head up and down and said, "Okay. Daniel." She looked down upon the foolish young girl in front of her. Janet's smile quickly froze on her face and left her expressionless. Daniel's eye seemed to be taking every opportunity to diss her. The bastard. And this time, not only did he just diss her, but he also went a step forward and humiliated her. Janet felt uneasy with the events that were happening around her. She didn't even know what she really had in her mind and heart, but one fact was true enough, that she knew she was sad. If she was sad because of Daniel, then the others had to be like her as well. "Daniel, how can you do this to me? Last night on my bed you said that you loved me." Love? Bah! Why did Janet say this? She wasn't thinking straight. Before anyone had a chance to reply, Janet immediately started to regret her words. Of course, Kate knew from the start that Janet was trying to provoke her. She held Daniel's arm more intimately and said to Janet, "Let bygones be bygones. I trust Daniel, and I'm sure he wouldn't do it again. Don't bet on it. We're neighbors. If you're in a favorable position, you also have some neat advantages. For example, I can be his lover and his neighbor at the same time." Ha ha ha. Spark couldn't help but laugh at what he had just heard. Both his lover and his neighbor. Ha ha ha. However, the bitterness that started to spread from the back seats made him to stop laughing and concentrate on his driving. "You're hoping too much. As Daniel's girlfriend, I'll be staying with him in every moment of the day." Shame on her. Stop. Janet suddenly had a headache after she heard Kate's words. She untied her seat belt and asked Spark to pull over. Those who brag about their love die sooner. Miss Song should be careful. Spark was stunned by Janet's words, and when she got out of the car she also furiously slammed the door. He didn't understand why Janet had quarreled with Miss Song a minute ago and got out the car. The whole situation was an embarrassment. Kate looked at Janet's figure through the windows and gnashed her teeth in anger. "Go!" Daniel ordered Spark in a calm voice. Spark and Kate didn't have the faintest idea about what he was really thinking about. Janet didn't return to the villa and decided to call Shirley, but learned that she was returning to her hometown because she was set up for a blind date. A blind date. Shirley was only 22 years old. Janet looked on the street at the heavy traffic and wondered why Shirley was so anxious and looking forward to it. Then Janet called Sally, but Sally was upset. How was she so easily seduced by Jerry's handsome looks, and how did she give herself so willingly to him? Janet asked her to go out and have some drinks together, and Sally agreed without hesitation. Then Janet called Sven, who had finished a surgery, and was now resting. When he heard Janet's invitation, he promptly accepted it. He had been very busy for some time and now had the chance to relax a bit before returning to his work. Janet called Samuel and told him she was going out shopping with Sally. Then she went straight to the bar. In the Soho bar, Sally and Janet were joyfully singing together in the bar. People united by the same affliction tend to pity on each other. Sally was upset by Janet's brother, and Janet was upset by Sally's. But they didn't speak with each other of their problems. Instead, they expressed their grievances by yelling as loud as they could at the microphone. They were starting to really give Sven a hard time. He went out and called Jerry. "Jerry, come here. Sally and Jane are here too." After he hung up the phone, he saw Daniel, who was just coming out of the restroom. "Hi, Daniel." "Sven." Sven looked at Daniel curiously. "What are you doing here?" "Client meeting," replied Daniel. He took out his cigarette box, gave Sven a cigarette and lit it. "It's good to see you here. Sally and Jane are drinking and singing like they're crazy. I feel like I'm going to be deaf soon if I stay any longer with them." He finally had someone to complain to. Sven now regretted that he had accepted Jane's invitation. He came there to relax but became even more stressed than before. The girls were singing in the room behind Sven, and Daniel listened on them and heard Sally's voice. Daniel frowned and said to Sven, "I'll pick up Sally back later." He had nothing to do with the other one. "Okay, I already called Jerry. He'll also be here soon," replied Sven. The two men were smoking outside and suddenly the door opposite to them was opened with Kate walking out of it. Seeing that Daniel was smoking outside, she greeted him and walked towards to him. "Daniel," she said. Kate had also drunk a few glasses of wine and was a bit tipsy now. She held Daniel's arm and gently leaned on his shoulder. Sven raised one of his eyebrows to Daniel and snapped at him, "Bro, don't I get introduced?" Kate took a deep breath and felt a little more sober. She eventually introduced herself to Sven. "Good evening. I'm Kate Song, Daniel's girlfriend." "Kate Song." Jane Shao opened the door and heard Kate's self-introduction. "Kate Song? The well-known beauty boss in the business circle. You have a well-deserved reputation. Good evening, my name is Sven Si." Sven shook hands with Kate. Jane waved her hand. "Whatever, I need to go to the restroom." When Jane turned right after walking out of the room, she was suddenly stopped by Sven. "Jane, where are you going?" he asked. Janet had 2 bottles of beer in her hand and had a flushed face. She looked at Sven and held her arm on his shoulder. "The rest room, of course." "Sven, are you also going to the ladies' room with me?" "Ha ha ha." Sven sighed to himself. When they were younger, he could have bullied Jane for these words. But now they were older, Jane had become a taekwondo enthusiast, and only she could do the bullying now. "Silly girl, the rest room is right over there." Sven held Jane, who was drunk, and helped her walk. Janet leaned against Sven, closed her eyes and followed him. Sven was really a nice guy. Kate saw Jane and became much sober. This girl was so hateful. Could have she followed them to the bar? Daniel walked towards the room they were in. Kate had no time to look at his expression and immediately followed him. And Sven called Jerry to ask him to take Jane back home. However, when Jerry saw Sally drinking beer, he took the bottle out of her hand and quickly dragged Sally out of the bar. "Sven, take my sister to the villa." "No, better yet, take her to your house." "I'll call my father first." Jerry trusted Sven. But if Ella saw that Jane was drunk, she would have gone nuts. On the other hand, Sally could handle her alcohol pretty well. She had 4 bottles of beer and she was totally fine. Seeing that she was in Jerry's arms now, Sally struggled with discontent. "Jerry Shao, let me go, I can walk on my own."